If we're going to discuss Blizzie Knows Best and the gradual decline of World of Warcraft, we have to talk about Wrath of the Lich King. So let's do so. This is MultimediaJay Radio Style for Wednesday, March 13th, 2019. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay Radio Style.
If you follow the current ongoing discussions about the downfall of WoW, it's not if, but when you hear about Wrath of the Lich King. And this is interesting. It's funny how people will look at Wrath of the Lich King as this golden standard-setting expansion that can do no wrong, when in reality, not only did Wrath of the Lich King have its problems, but Wrath of the Lich King was a little bit more controversial in its day and age than a lot of us nowadays will give it credit for. To see what I'm talking about, just look for the term Wrath Babies, referring to people who started playing during Lich King and not during the previous two content packs that were considered harder. Well, that's a subjective term, but that's what was floating around back in those days, along with, of course, Wrath Baby. So as someone who was there for it all, I have to refer to Wrath of the Lich King, both in terms of its ups and its downs, because like any other video game out there at the time, it had its ups and downs. That's just the way it is. No matter how much we may want to put on the rose-tinted goggles and look back on the so-called good old days of Wrath, Wrath had its issues too, and we can see this in the numbers. And this is why we're having this discussion today, to see where Wrath of the Lich King fits into the context of Blizzie Knows Best. As I mentioned earlier, I agree with the people, the commentators and the nostalgics and the people that are looking back on where WoW went wrong and having all these discussions about it nowadays in the BFA era. I agree with the people who consider Lich King to be the peak of the game and also where the problems began that eventually led to its decline and where it is today. Basically, early Lich King and late Lich King is where this torch was passed. Now, I already mentioned earlier that a lot of the problems with World of Warcraft throughout its history have stemmed from the whole attitude of get to the good stuff, where all that matters is a certain small part of the game, and because of that, people devalue the entire rest of the game, and eventually the developers follow suit and devalue it as well, leading to what we have today, where you have 120 levels and a big, huge world, but only a tiny amount of zones actually matter. Nobody cares about questing through Lakeshire or, Dust Wallow Marsh or Durotar or anything, because it's just something you get over with to get to the good stuff. You don't talk about the incredible Razorfen Downs or whatever run you had, because it's all about getting to the good stuff. And that mindset is so ingrained in the player base that the devs have to follow along because they've created this monster. And if we look very closely at what things were like during Lich King and when this torch was passed, we can see where this train started going off the rails. So in terms of early Lich King versus late Lich King, the big difference that was firmly in place by ICC, Icecrown Citadel, was that by the time Icecrown Citadel came out, only the current content would be focused on, because there were ways to completely circumvent the entire rest of the story up to this point. If you power leveled into the Lich King content, you could skip all the previous tiers. You could skip running through the Heroics, you could skip Naxxramas, you could skip Ulduar, you could even skip Trial of the Crusader and get your catch-up gear from 5-mans in ICC. Now, these 5-mans were harder than the original 5-mans, but it was a way for people to skip the entire story and then go fight the Lich King. Prior to this, we see an environment that is not unlike that of Final Fantasy XIV today, where everything is one gigantic coherent story up until the current content, and you gradually progress through the story, and you gradually just make your way through things without skipping to the good stuff. Unless, of course, you want to buy a boost. But the people that went to the Mog Station and buy the boosts stick out compared to the players that actually played the game through. You'll see it in dungeon groups and stuff, as well as people just trying to learn their rotations with their fresh level 60. But I digress. One very important thing that I forgot to mention last time I talked about this sort of thing is that when you joined a guild in the days leading up to early Wrath, the guild would refer to itself based on its current progression. For example, in Burning Crusade, if you joined a Kara guild, you're basically joining a small, tight-knit group of 10-man raider types who would farm the heck out of Karazhan. And of course, Zul'Aman later, once it came out as a 10-man raid. This is one of the reasons why I agreed with the standardization of the raid sizes in early Lich King, because in Burning Crusade, you would have your SSC guilds and your Black Temple guilds and your Sunwell guilds, and a lot of times the logistics of needing to maintain a 25-man raid team versus a 10-man raid team spelled the difference between whether you got to do the content or not. In essence, the so-called, if you want to call it a rough draft, of Blizzard wanting more people to see more content was probably a better solution back in Lich King's days than LFR. You had to organize, you had to get with some people here and there, and actually if it were up to me, I probably would have still had Dungeon Finder and LFR, but I would not have any kind of lowering of the difficulty just so people could see the content. I would have figured out some other kind of skill rating system behind the scenes that would pair players up with players of similar skill level so that you didn't have situations where someone was ruining a bunch of other people's fun because it was a pug. And of course, by ICC, you did the ICC 5-mans, and then you were ready to join the raid team, or you could go raid older stuff and have it be a lot easier and basically nerf the difficulty of Naxxramas, Ulduar, and even the Crusaders Colosseum with the catch-up gear. And this is where the problem ultimately comes from, is that only the current content matters. So there's no reason to even keep up with the story anymore. Just, oh, when am I logging in? Okay, this is what's going on right now. Let's try these bosses. And then you go into this dungeon or this raid, and you don't know anything at all about why the bosses are there or why you're fighting it. And you wonder why you get bored with the game and want to unsubscribe. Because you don't know the lore, you don't know the story, and more fundamentally, Blizzard has traditionally encouraged people to get to the good stuff. Then, of course, after ICC, we had Halion in the Ruby Sanctum, which my raiding team actually downed before the expansion came out. So that was fun, at least, but it was the bigger raids the longer raids that were more of an issue because of the logistics of having to clear your way through to this boss or that boss in order to full clear it. But let's back away from some of these details here, and let's look at the concept and the philosophy that's in play here. There was a sense of urgency that you didn't want to play through the previous story, that you just wanted to kill the Lich King. I mean, this was, after all, the closing of a story arc that had been in place since Warcraft 3. Of course you wanted to get involved in the ICC raids and things along those lines. But what was going on behind the scenes while we were all caught up on this high of finally ending a story arc that had been going on for years and years since the Warcraft 3 days? Up until the grand shift in how Blizzard ran things, you had your Naxx guilds and your Ulduar guilds. So what happened afterwards? As the catch-up mechanics started to become more of a thing, and you could get all of this gear to go into the current content with. But why did it even have to be a thing? Why did we even need catch-up mechanics? Why did we even have to have some kind of urgency to go kill the Lich King? Well, Cataclysm is coming out. Well, there was a big content drought between when ICC released and when Cataclysm launched. Cataclysm came out. It was the first of the infamous content droughts that would happen at the end of every expansion afterwards. Why? Why hurry up and kill the Lich King? Were there no guilds that could have gone through Naxxramas, then Ulduar, then the Crusaders Colosseum, and then finally to Lich King in one coherent story during the huge amount of downtime between the end of Lich King's content, not counting Halion, of course, and the launch of Cataclysm? Why was there this sense of urgency? Because the new expansion was coming out. Because Blizzard let themselves and their audience compartmentalize the story up to this point. And this has been the big adjustment that I've had to get used to when I went over to Final Fantasy. That I had A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, and Stormblood. And I was actually in a rush to get through A Realm Reborn because I'm like, I have all this content. Oh, it's so annoying. I have to go all the way through A Realm Reborn, all the way through the patch leading up to Heavensward, all the way through Heavensward, all the way through the post-Heavensward content, and finally get to Stormblood to be on current content. But then I stopped and thought about it. It is all one coherent story about the Warrior of Light. This attitude of getting to the good stuff that I brought with me from World of Warcraft was a bad habit that had to be left at the side of the road in order to have any kind of constructive, meaningful journey through this game. I know it sounds taboo to any WoW player with any amount of significant time in the game under their belt, but think about how different things could have been if Blizzard hadn't gone down this road and hadn't compartmentalized the expansions like this, so that you had to be in a rush to down bosses because the new expansion was coming out, as if it would be taboo for people to take their time and experience the story so they're not jumping in several chapters later, so to speak. And this is why we have to stop idolizing Lich King so much, because the underlying philosophy of get to the good stuff is the most sneaky way that Blizzie knows best has led to the kind of discussions that we have nowadays. Both players among players, players to the devs, devs among devs, and the way the game has declined in the last 10 years. Imagine a world where there was no gear reset going into Burning Crusade, where if you had Burning Crusade, cool, work your way up to level 60, then take the portal to Outland, and your quests will not jump you way ahead in power because of a gear reset. And of course, later in Lich King, things along those lines, people complaining about their purples being replaced with greens. All of this led to the compartmentalization of what should have been a coherent story. To say nothing of the world revamp and what it did to the progression of things, where you go from Cataclysm to Burning Crusade to Lich King, back to Cataclysm, and then finally you progress forward with things. But even the Death Knight starting area was a warning sign of this. You went through Lich King content, and then for no reason whatsoever you had to go running off to Outland. Oh, you were mad at Arthas, da-da-da. But couldn't there have been some kind of story where, you had to go under the radar for a bit before you could strike back? Death Knights having to go to Outland was probably one of the things I saw people raising their eyebrows about the most. It was basically it was the story essentially being kind of sent to an intermission while your character went out to old content to get clown-style armor. But that was a warning sign of things to come with the progression and stuff. And that's why we're in the position that we're in today. And that's why people are saying what they're saying about BFA. Get to the good stuff is a big thing. Only the current content matters, and the progression of a single story of your character going from zero to hero, it's not there, and it can't be there because of the decisions that were made that gave us what we have today. And where's the incentive for Blizzard to fix any of this? Especially with what happened during Cataclysm, with how many resources were diverted away because of the overworld revamp. How much work would it take to give World of Warcraft a coherent story again and fix the current narrative issues that exist in the whole leveling thing and make it so that you want to work your way up to level 120 instead of buying a boost? What do you think that would do in terms of new players being scattered throughout the world if there was an environment where it made sense to do so instead of buying a boost to join your friends as that idiot in the raid that doesn't know their rotation because they bought a boost? And I think the final what-if question in this whole discussion about where the torch was passed during Lich King, between early and late Lich King, the final what-if we have to ask, though, is, suppose Blizzard had succeeded, and it was worth it to have one coherent story through all the previous expansions up to BFA. Would they have been able to ward off the bean counters, the people that screamed about monetization, and how that the game wasn't being monetized enough, and that the average revenue per user needed to go up, and all these things that people are getting all mad about nowadays, about video games that are not made for players anymore? What then? I'll leave that to you folks to speculate. For now, things are the way they are. Blizzie knows best, struck back in Cataclysm. But by then, it was too late. And so the decline began, and now here we are today. And so after all this, after expansion after expansion after expansion is supposed to put the war back in Warcraft, rekindle the fight between the Alliance and the Horde, bring back what made the game great in years gone by. How much more of this vicious cycle do the angry players out there have to continue to endure before they finally say enough is enough? Don't fantasize about Lich King, because I'm not taking you seriously unless you link the achievement and have at least a 5,000 gear score, and I'm definitely not taking you seriously if you bought that stupid store mount that makes you look like you killed Algalon. And there's a nice little test to see how many folks listening in actually were around back in those days, because you'll get the jokes if you were. So, folks, in terms of Blizzie knows best, you can say all the nice things about Lich King, and yes, things did change in Lich King, but to an extent, Blizzard's philosophy of get to the good stuff and compartmentalizing content also has a role to play in why we're in the position that we are in today, having the discussions that we are having today. This is MultimediaJay, signing off. Thanks for stopping by.